Wijk aan Zee 2013 is now over, and I think it's fitting that we finish with my final play of the day with the player that won the tournament, Magnus Carlsen. So today he was playing against Anish Giri. Carlsen had the black pieces. Giri opened with d4, and Carlsen fianchettoed. So although Carlsen already won the tournament, he was 1.5 points clear going into this final round, it's clear from this move that he wants a fight. You know, he's not playing something dull. So f3. Now, if black wants to, it's possible to play this kind of Grunfeld, and this is a very, very popular variation indeed. You might recall the Anand Gelfand World Championship match where this line was played. But instead Carlsen played for a King's Indian, as we've already seen in the tournament. So now we have a Zamish variation, a very, very popular line. Well, it remains popular, but very popular in the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s, and one of several excellent systems against the King's Indian. And the line that Carlsen plays with e5 is quite an old line, actually. There were two games in this line from the 1953 Candidates tournament, this famous tournament that was won by Smyslov, where so many of the top players in the 1950s were playing. Petrosian, Geller, Averbach, Bronstein, Reshevsky. I mean, it's just an amazing tournament. And there are a couple of games where Gligorich played with the black pieces in exactly this line. So it's a very old line indeed, and strategically very complex. And in a way, no surprise that Carlsen picked this line to play with black, because, well, as Giri said after the game, he wasn't sure about this line. He said, you know, do you close the king side pawns? Do you play on the queen side? You know, which pawn breaks do you allow? Which do you go for? Strategically, it's very rich indeed. Okay, so you can see the king side structure is locked. White's king has gone to the queen side. Now, with bishop f6, black would like to play bishop h4, exchanging off the so-called bad bishop for white's good bishop. That's why queen e1 is played, to prevent that exchange. Now knight e7, king b1, good move. This makes room for white's knight to come to c1 and then perhaps to d3, sometimes to b3 as well. And sometimes a rook goes to c1. Bishop e7. Well, this covers d6, d6, perhaps is prophylaxis against c5, but you'll see why it's important to cover d6 in a second. Also makes room for a knight to come to f6 as well. Now, as I said, there are several ways that white can play this position. It's a very rich position indeed. Now, one thing you can do is play g4 and basically lock the king side, so black can keep the position close. So you can lock the king side like this, and then play completely on the queen side. That's possible, and even just go for your same standard c5 advance. Let me show you just a game very, very quickly. Instead of locking the king side with g4, this is a game that Georgiou played, the Romanian grandmaster, who's a very, very strong player in the 1970s and early 1980s. Let me show you how he played with white. b4 straight away. Now, it's possible to do this even though your king is on b1, because black has little space. It's counterattack, and white's pieces can actually come over to the queen side to cover the king very easily. So, for example, after a5, okay, you can play like this, and now this is a really important maneuver, bringing the knight to c1 and then to b3. You can see that white has all the squares covered, and eventually you actually go for a breakthrough on the queen side, for example here. And well, Georgiou eventually won a very, very nice game indeed. But it is strategically very rich. You don't have to play exactly the same way as black. I think black played a bit too passively there. Perhaps you should play on the king side. Okay, anyway, Giri chose g3 instead, so keeping some fluidity on the king side. c5 by Carlsen. After the game, Giri said that he was really pleased to see this move, and he thought, well, he was more concerned, let's say, about black waiting before he made a break on the queen side with a6 and maybe rook b8, keeping white guessing and maybe going for c5 later on. The reason he was pleased to see c5 was that now he had a very clear plan. Of course, you can still come back to play this kind of thing, knight around here and a3 and b4, but black is more solid with a pawn on c5, and also black sometimes tries to break things open himself with this move. But Giri said he was pleased to see this because now he could break open the position. c5, it's a nice move. Obviously there's a pin on the d file, so knight takes c5 just isn't possible because that can be taken. And now Giri said that he kind of understood the position a bit better. It was more, well, it's kind of easier to play this position for white. It's the battle lines are clearer. Well, here what you've done is white has given a pawn, but of course it's going to be fairly easy to recapture this pawn quite quickly, and then, well, black has very weak pawns here. Let's see how things continue. Queen c3, good move. Okay, black desperately needs counterplay, so starts that with this. Now, Giri selected bishop h3. I also quite like the look of this. For example, just closing here and recapturing the pawn, and you're ready to. Once you get your pieces into the game, then these are the weak pawns, and black's king is not fantastically placed. This one should be back on f7 covering the king. Let me see, but he chose bishop h3, also a very interesting move, and Carlsen had clearly underestimated the chances that white has in this position. This knight rather dominates this bishop. Of course, black doesn't want to make it easy for white by taking here, and then white develops very, very simply. Yeah, it's not easy for black to generate play on the b file. By the way, if you play bishop takes knight and try for knight a4, hitting lots of things, then queen c4 is unfortunate for black, forking knight and king. Okay, so therefore rook f7 by Carlsen, so that's basically just to cover this diagonal, but you can see that really that pawn should perhaps be back on f7. That would be a completely different opening, but that's the risk when you play the King's Indian, when you advance like this. Okay, b3 from Giri, very solid, okay, preventing that threat now that the king is covered. And, well, this is a difficult position for black, very difficult indeed. Carlsen chose to exchange here and take on c5, and that enables him to bring out his bishop once that knight has gone. But it's clear that white has a very strong position here. White's only problem is developing his pieces, developing his king side, and you can see there's just a little bit of pressure on f3, which just saves Carlsen in the end. By the way, he can't take here and here because of knight g5, forking these two. Okay, so rook c1, threatening c6, so bishop e6. Well, it's not, I mean, defending this c pawn in the end is, I think, would be pretty hopeless. I think black has to play actively here. Giri took, well, if you could also take like this, but then that brings the knight to g5, and okay, black's back in the game. So Giri took immediately. Now if the queens are exchanged, then this is a pretty healthy extra pawn actually in the endgame. I think the black's problem is that that rook on c6 dominates black's pieces. You can see this knight simply can't come into the game via e6. This knight is poorly placed. So even though for a moment white's pieces look strange on the king's side, black can't really generate enough activity. So instead of that, Carlsen played queen e7. I think he had to keep the queens on here to keep his chances alive. Now it starts getting tricky. If you exchange and bring the knight into play, not great. So Giri started chasing the queen. And now he said after the game that he played bishop g2, but he said after the game he didn't like this. Clearly this is a very risky move because, okay, the idea is to protect f3 to bring the knight into the game, but it takes so much time, and objectively this is probably the best continuation, but in practical terms it gives black a lot of counterplay, and white has to play so precisely here. For example, this is the move we want to play. We need to be able to develop the knight. But now, well, you have to watch out for these sacrifices. I mean, this is terrifying. I mean, probably this is okay for white, but tough to calculate. And another move, a5, very simply, just to open up the b file. And if this is taken, then we can switch to the a file. This could be extremely dangerous. So I think understandably Giri played king a1. I think it's the best move. Now knight d7 and queen d6 was played, a good practical move, basically making sure that if this bishop does sacrifice, then at least white can exchange queens. Now I was commentating live on this game in the afternoon, and lots of people who were clearly looking at this game with computer software were saying, why not queen a3? My computer says this is +2 for white. Okay, objectively this might be the best move, but in practical terms this is simply too difficult to play. Way too difficult to play. You have to analyse this sacrifice, and this is already absolutely terrifying. If you get this wrong, you are checkmated. Now if you're using a computer, you might be able to tread a delicate path through to finally exploit your extra piece. But look, while these pieces are on the king's side, this is a terrifying position to play. Objectively, probably better for white. I mean, I'm not even going to go through variations, and also another, even if bishop takes b3 doesn't terrify you enough, there's also a5, also a very tricky move to have to meet, with the simple idea of after knight a2 sacrificing and then perhaps queen f8 or queen d8 and trying to get play on the a file. So I completely understand why Giri decided to play more practically and played queen d6, making sure that black can't generate so much activity. Now this actually allows bishop takes b3, but in this case he can exchange queens. And here at first I thought, well, I thought white should actually play this position on, because he has the two bishops, and it just felt to me as though white was still better in this position, even though material is equal. But probably black is alright here after this. I mean, there aren't that many pawns on the board, and it's not so easy to to bring these pieces into play. So I don't know, I have a feeling if Carlsen were white, he might have played that position, but probably black is alright. But instead, I think by this point Giri had had enough, and he took this, and this is basically results in a forced draw. The threat is to play rook a3 and mate. So if king a2, then we play rook b2 check and win the piece back with a huge advantage. So white has to play rook c2 in order to meet rook a3 with rook a2. And then rook check. Black has nothing better than this, by the way. And rook here, threatening mate again, and the king has to retreat, and that's a draw by repetition. So an honourable draw in the end. Good stuff. It's great to see Carlsen really battling away in the last round, but he had problems there. Okay, so final scores. Carlsen has 10 out of 13, magnificent score. 1.5 points ahead of Aronian on 8.5, and then in joint 3rd and 4th place Anand and Karyarkin. Thanks very much for watching. If you enjoyed these clips, then do subscribe to my YouTube channel. I post regular clips there, and it's free to subscribe. Thanks. See you.